In a major setback for LGBTQ plus rights, the Supreme Court last week sided with the Catholic foster care agency, ruling that they don't have to consider married LGBTQ plus couples as potential foster care parents, even though this violates anti-discrimination laws in Philadelphia. The much-awaited decision, applauded by many conservative and religious groups, surprised legal experts, especially since the court's more liberal justices signed off on the decision. With me to discuss this ruling is Imani Rupert-Gordon, the executive director for the National Center for Lesbian Rights. Imani, thanks for being here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so this decision allows this Catholic foster care agency to exclude LGBTQ plus married couples who want to foster children from consideration. What does this mean for the fight for equality for the LGBTQ community?
Sure. So the decision actually can be a bit confusing because that's not exactly what happened. So when we were waiting for this decision, we really were looking for the intersection between civil rights and religious liberty. And the decision that came down, the court very specifically focused on the contract between Catholic Social Services and the city of Philadelphia. And so when they ruled in favor of Catholic Social Services, it was a very narrow ruling because we're talking specifically about a part of this contract that wouldn't necessarily exist in other contracts. And so this is really important because though it does create it has very real implications for LGBTQ people in Philadelphia. It doesn't have, it won't broadly hurt other LGBTQ people. And then it also reaffirms that the government can prohibit religious entities from discriminating against LGBTQ people. And so that was a bit confusing, though they did rule in favor of Catholic Social Services. It was because of this contract in particular. And that was something that was really, really important.
Oh, I see. Thanks for the clarification on that. So LGBTQ plus parents, especially Black lesbian women, are at particular risk of losing their children, though, to the foster care system. Can you speak to us about the dynamics there at play?
Sure. So what we're talking about when we talk about the child welfare system, very often we are talking about Black families in particular. And so when we're talking about this being an LGBTQ issue, which it is because we're talking about LGBTQ people that want to be adoptive parents or want to be foster care parents, and they aren't able to because of the discrimination that's happening. But what we don't always consider is a different part of this issue, and that is how the children become involved in the child welfare system. And when you look at that, we realize that when children are taken away from their mothers, Black lesbian and bisexual women are 4 times more likely than Black heterosexual women to have their children taken away by the state and then put into the child welfare system. And that is incredibly important because there's discrimination that's happening, how the children are being taken away, but then it also makes it hard because of racism and because of LGBTQ identities and discrimination for these mothers to get their children back in a variety of ways. And so that is an LGBTQ issue as well. And it's important that we think about that because as soon as a child becomes system involved, and that includes being involved with the child welfare system, children are more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system and are much more likely to experience homelessness or housing instability later in their life. And this is from a direct result of being involved in the child welfare system.
What are the particular issues that LGBTQ plus youth of color, especially Black youth, experience in the foster care system?
Sure. We're looking at intersections of identity when you're talking about someone, if you're talking about a child that's an LGBTQ child, and then also dealing with racism, it's not that they are one or the other, it's multiplicative. And so we're talking about discrimination that happens based on race, based on gender, based on sexual orientation. But in the systems that we see here, very often we're talking about poverty. We're talking about racism and the intersection of poverty. And so how these children are becoming system involved is because so often poverty is being confused with neglect. And that's just a horrible thing to think about. But we know that disproportionately, this is going to impact Black mothers in particular. When thinking about even just thinking the potential for neglect is reason to take someone from their parents. And what we realize is that when young folks are taken from their parents, and they shouldn't be, we're talking about poverty, which is an entirely separate issue, and an entirely separate issue that could be corrected in a different way as well. Because when we think about going into systems, we're also paying other families in order to take care of these young people, but they were taken away from their parents because, in theory, their parents couldn't afford. There's because of poverty, they couldn't provide the same sort of resources. And if there's a way that we could just change that around a little bit, we would be able to protect more young people and keep more families together, especially Black families.
Now, Imani, last night we talked to Tremaine Jones, the director of the LGBTQ Freedom Fund, about the fact that people in those communities are incarcerated at 3 times the rate of the general population and some of the underlying issues. Take a listen.
When you look at the data, it shows that 1 in 2 homeless youth will identify as LGBTQ. So that's over 50% of young people identifying as LGBTQ who are homeless. So we see that there is still a big issue around acceptance of LGBTQ folks in our society. And so if young people are being pushed out into the streets and don't have the ability to have access to just general resources such as housing, food, oftentimes young people are engaging in just being able to survive. And so what generally can happen is that a young person can get arrested simply for just sleeping on a park bench, or a young person can get arrested for engaging in underground economies such as survival sex work. We see this issue all the time when it comes to young people just trying to survive simply because they got kicked out of their home.
Talk to me about the increased risk that LGBTQ plus youth face of getting caught up in the criminal legal system, especially those in foster care.
Sure. I mean, we know that young people that are in foster care are more likely to run away, but also receive treatment where they're discriminated against, even within these systems, even within these families. And so, once folks are out, just like in the clip that we heard, young people have to find a way to survive, and in doing that, oftentimes get caught up in systems. And once a young person is caught up in the system, if it is foster care, but also juvenile justice and criminal justice and all of these systems, they're much more likely to be caught up in and stay system involved throughout their lifetime. And we know that once this happens, young people don't typically get stronger after this. We see that it continues to hold folks down. It makes it harder to get a job later, so that you're able to take care of yourself and take care of your families, and creates this cycle that makes it really difficult. And we know that that's disproportionately impacting LGBTQ people.
Imani Rupert-Gordon, Executive Director of the National Center for Lesbian Rights. Thank you again for coming on tonight.
Thanks for having me.